He did not walk onto that stage to give a speech. He walked onto it to accept his fate. Most men would have stayed home that Sunday. The death threats were no longer whispers. They were screaming from the telephone lines, and the smell of gasoline from the firebombing at his home a week prior still lingered in his clothes. But on the afternoon of February 21st, 1965, he didn't run. He adjusted his tie, looked out at the cold, smoky air of the Audubon Ballroom, and smiled at his pregnant wife and 4 daughters sitting in the front row. He wanted them to see him standing tall one last time. Then a scuffle broke out. A distraction. "Get your hand out of my pocket." The air shattered. A sawed-off shotgun blast didn't just tear through a man's chest. It tore a hole in the heart of the civil rights movement. But as the smoke cleared and the screams of his family filled the room, a terrifying question began to rise, louder than the gunshots. Why was there no police protection that day? Why did the authorities stand down right when the most hunted man in America needed them most? This was not just a random act of violence. This was a calculated assassination designed to bury a truth that America is only just beginning to uncover. Malcolm X was silenced. But why are we still afraid to talk about who really pulled the strings? To understand the man who stood in the crosshairs of history, you cannot just look at the suits and the speeches. You have to go back to the boy who watched his world burn long before he knew how to fight the fire. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, but he was born into a war. His father, Earl Little, was a preacher who spoke of pride and independence, dangerous words for a black man in the 1920s. The Ku Klux Klan didn't just knock on their door. They rode around their house with shotguns, shattering the windows. Before Malcolm was even born, the violence of racism was already hunting him. The first major scar on his soul came when he was just 6 years old. His father's body was found nearly severed in 2 across streetcar tracks. The authorities called it a suicide to avoid paying the life insurance. But the little family knew the truth. It was a message. It was a warning. And for young Malcolm, it was a lesson that the law was not designed to protect people like him. But the tragedy didn't end at the funeral. The state welfare system slowly dismantled what was left of his family. They declared his mother, Louise, insane for grieving the murder of her husband and the poverty forced upon her children. They took her away to a mental institution, and they took the children away from each other. Malcolm was no longer a son. He was a ward of the state, a number in the system. He was smart, brilliantly smart, but when a teacher told him that being a lawyer was no realistic goal for a nigger, something inside him shut down. If the world saw him as nothing, he would become the best at being nothing. He drifted to Boston, then Harlem, shedding the skin of Malcolm Little and becoming Detroit Red. This is the chapter of his life that many textbooks try to skip, but it is essential. Detroit Red was not a leader. He was a hustler. He wore zoot suits and electric colors, straightened his hair with burning lye to look more like the white men he despised, and lost himself in the rhythm of the nightlife. He sold drugs, ran numbers, and carried guns. He was living fast, numb to the pain of his past, trying to outrun the shadow of his father's death. He was exactly what the system expected him to be, a young black man destroying himself. But the cage was waiting. In 1946, at just 20 years old, the law finally caught up with him. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for burglary. It should have been the end of his story. For most men, Charlestown State Prison was a graveyard for the living. But for Malcolm, it became a monastery. It was behind those cold steel bars that the transformation began. He met a man named Bimby, a fellow inmate who commanded respect not with his fists, but with his words. Malcolm realized that he had been mute his whole life, unable to articulate the rage burning inside him. So, he started to read. He didn't just read books, he devoured them. When the lights went out in his cell, he would read by the glow of the corridor light, ruining his eyes but sharpening his mind. He copied the entire dictionary, page by page, word by word, learning the language of the oppressor so he could one day dismantle their arguments. Then came the letters from his siblings about a man named Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. They spoke of a devil, the white man, and a God who looked like them. For a man who had only known abuse and rejection from the white world, this wasn't just religion. It was a revelation. It was the first time someone told him that his black skin was not a curse, but a crown. He dropped the name Little, a name given to his ancestors by slave masters, and replaced it with the letter X. The X stood for the unknown, the African name that had been stolen and erased by history. When he walked out of prison in 1952, Detroit Red was dead. Malcolm X was alive. He was no longer a criminal. He was a weapon of truth, forged in the darkness of a cell, ready to wake up a sleeping nation. He had found his voice, and soon, the whole world, and the FBI surveillance teams that would shadow his every step, would be forced to listen. When Malcolm X stepped out of prison, he didn't just join the movement, he ignited it. Throughout the 1950s and early 60s, while the mainstream civil rights movement was marching for integration and singing, "We shall overcome," Malcolm was preaching a different, harder gospel. He didn't want to sit at a lunch counter next to white people. He wanted to own the restaurant. He didn't ask for permission to exist. He demanded the power to build. His rise within the Nation of Islam was meteoric. He wasn't just a minister. He was a force of nature. With his towering height, his reddish hair, and his horn-rimmed glasses, he cut a figure of absolute intellectual authority. But it was his voice that captivated the streets. It was a baritone instrument that could slice through the humid air of a Harlem rally like a razor. He spoke the unspoken thoughts of the black working class, the frustration of the maid, the anger of the factory worker, the despair of the unemployed. He famously said, "We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us." Under his tireless leadership, the Nation of Islam grew from a small sect of 400 members to a powerhouse of 40,000. He established temples across the country, founded a newspaper, and became the face of black pride. He told black men and women that their features, their lips, their noses, their hair were beautiful long before it became a popular slogan. He gave them a spine, but this power came with a price. He became the boogeyman for white America. While Martin Luther King Jr. was presented as the saint of peace, Malcolm X was painted as the apostle of hate. The media called him a demagogue, a violence monger. But Malcolm wasn't preaching violence. He was preaching self-defense. "I don't call it violence when self-defense," he argued. "I call intelligence." He terrified the establishment because he refused to turn the other cheek. He looked the camera in the eye and exposed the hypocrisy of American democracy with surgical precision. This level of influence drew the attention of the highest powers. FBI surveillance files on Malcolm began to grow thicker by the day. Agents were planted in the crowds at his speeches. His phone lines were tapped. His movements were tracked. They were waiting for him to slip, waiting for a reason to silence him. The government saw a messiah who could unite the radical elements of the country, and that made him dangerous. Yet, behind the podium and the fierce rhetoric, there was a man deeply in love. He met Betty Sanders, Sister Betty X, at the temple. She was strong, educated, and one of the few people who could challenge him. They married and built a family, a sanctuary away from the chaos of the public eye. In rare, quiet moments, photographs show Malcolm X not as the fiery leader, but as a tender father, letting his daughters climb on his shoulders, laughing with a softness the world rarely saw. He was fighting for their future, for a world where they wouldn't have to grow up with the shame he felt as a child. But the higher he rose, the longer the shadows became. Success breeds jealousy, even among brothers. Inside the Nation of Islam, resentment was brewing. Other ministers whispered that Malcolm was taking too much credit, that he was becoming bigger than the organization itself, bigger perhaps than the leader, Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm remained loyal, deflecting praise to his teacher, unaware that the knives were being sharpened behind his back. The tension reached a breaking point in late 1963. After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, when the nation was in mourning, Malcolm made a comment that the chickens had come home to roost. It was a harsh statement about the climate of hate in America, but the media spun it as him rejoicing in the president's death. The backlash was immediate, but the blow that hurt the most didn't come from the white press. It came from inside his own house. The Nation of Islam silenced him for 90 days. It was the beginning of the end. The silence was not a punishment. It was a severance. The organization he had built with his sweat and soul was turning against him. The X that symbolized his identity was about to mark the spot for his execution. The stage was being set for a betrayal that would lead directly to the Audubon Ballroom. 1964 was the year the ground shifted beneath his feet. Breaking away from the Nation of Islam was not like quitting a job. It was like tearing off a limb. For 12 years, Elijah Muhammad had been his spiritual father. To leave was to accept excommunication, to be cut off from the community he helped build. He was suddenly alone, a general without an army, adrift in a country that still wanted him dead. Seeking clarity, he boarded a plane for the Middle East to perform the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca. What he found that would change him forever and ultimately seal his fate. In the holy city, he saw something the streets of America had convinced him was impossible. He saw blonde-haired, blue-eyed men praying shoulder to shoulder with Africans, eating from the same plate, sleeping on the same rugs. The concept of the white devil dissolved in the heat of the Arabian desert. He wrote a letter back home, his words trembling with a new realization. I have met true brotherhood. He returned to America not as Malcolm X, the angry separatist, but as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, a global human rights leader. He was ready to work with the civil rights leaders he had once criticized. He was ready to take the plight of African Americans to the United Nations. But if the government feared the old Malcolm, they were terrified of the new one. A man who preached separation could be contained. A man who preached global unity was a threat to the world order. The FBI surveillance reports from this period paint a picture of a tightening noose. They weren't just watching him. They were watching the people who were watching him. They knew the temperature was rising. The threats from his former brothers in the Nation of Islam became public and vicious. In their newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, cartoons depicted his severed head bouncing on the ground. Articles declared that hypocrites like Malcolm should be killed. These weren't subtle warnings. They were open contracts on his life. He tried to stay focused, founding the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAU, but the shadow of death was always just one step behind him. He began carrying a carbine rifle. He checked under the hood of his Oldsmobile for explosives every morning. He famously told a reporter, "I live like a man who is already dead." Then came the night of February 14th, 1965, 1 week before the end. It was 2:46 a.m. The house in East Elmhurst was asleep. Malcolm, Betty, and their 4 daughters were tucked in their beds. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass tore through the silence. A Molotov cocktail crashed through the front window. Then another. Fire! Get the children out! Malcolm screamed, grabbing his family and rushing them into the freezing winter night. As flames engulfed the home they had tried so hard to make a sanctuary, they stood on the lawn in their pajamas, shivering and watching their life turn to ash. But the cruelest blow didn't come from the fire. It came from the response. The police accused Malcolm of setting the fire himself to get publicity. That was the moment he knew. There would be no protection. The system that labeled him a villain was content to let him die. He sent his family to stay with friends while he lived out his suitcase, moving between hotels, never sleeping in the same place for long. He was exhausted, his eyes heavy with the weight of a prophet who knows his time is up. He told his associates, "It's a time for martyrs now, and if I'm to be one, it will be for the cause of brotherhood." On the morning of February 21st, he checked out of the New York Hilton. He declined the offer to search everyone entering the Audubon Ballroom that day. He said he didn't want to make people feel like they were in a prison. Perhaps he was tired of being afraid. Or perhaps he simply accepted that you cannot stop a train that has already left the station. He headed uptown, toward the stage where the assassins were already waiting. The clock on the wall of the Audubon Ballroom ticked past 3 p.m. The room was buzzing with about 400 people. It wasn't a large crowd, but it was a devoted one. At 3:10 p.m., Malcolm X walked onto the stage. He was greeted by a standing ovation. He looked tired, but he managed to smile. He stepped to the wooden podium, raised his hand, and spoke his final words to the world. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you. Wa alaikumu assalam. The crowd replied in unison. That was when the peace was broken. A disturbance erupted in the middle of the audience. A man yelled, "Nigger, get your hand out of my pocket." Heads turned. Bodyguards moved off their posts to investigate. It was a classic diversion tactic. In that split second of confusion, a man in the front row stood up. He didn't have a question. He had a sawed-off shotgun. The blast was deafening. The pellets struck Malcolm X squarely in the chest, knocking him backward over the chairs. But the horror didn't stop there. Two other men rushed the stage, firing semi-automatic pistols into his fallen body. It was an execution, a public, brutal, and coordinated assassination. Betty Shabazz, who had been sitting just feet away, threw her body over her children, screaming, "They're killing my husband! They're killing him!" Chaos swallowed the room. Smoke filled the air. One of the assassins, Talmadge Hayer, was caught and beaten by the crowd before police arrived. But the others slipped away into the Manhattan streets. At Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, doctors cut open his chest to massage his heart, but there was nothing left to save. At 3:30 p.m., the man who had given a voice to the voiceless was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The news hit America like a shockwave. In the white mainstream media, the narrative was cold and dismissive. The New York Times headline read, "Malcolm X shot to death." Many editorials implied that he lived by violence and died by violence, a convenient narrative that absolved the state of any responsibility. But in the streets of Harlem and across the globe in Africa and the Middle East, there was a different feeling, devastation, and suspicion. Martin Luther King Jr., though they often disagreed, called it a tragedy and warned that violence would only beget more violence. James Baldwin, writing from London, was furious, knowing that America had destroyed yet another one of its brilliant sons. Then came the justice. The police arrested 3 men. Talmadge Hayer, caught at the scene, and 2 others, Norman 3X Butler, later Muhammad Aziz, and Thomas 15X Johnson, later Khalil Islam. The trial was a farce. Hayer confessed on the stand. He admitted he was one of the shooters, but he also testified, under oath, that Butler and Johnson were not there. He said they were innocent. He even offered to name the real accomplices. The judge and the jury didn't care. The prosecution needed to close the case. They needed to show that this was just a black-on-black crime, an internal feud within the Nation of Islam. All 3 men were sentenced to life in prison. Case closed. For decades, the world accepted this story, but the streets knew better. Historians knew better. It wasn't until February 2020, with the release of the documentary series, Who Killed Malcolm X, that the cracks in the official story became too big to ignore. The documentary presented overwhelming evidence that Aziz and Islam were innocent and that the Real killers had lived free lives in Newark, New Jersey. This pressure forced the Manhattan District Attorney to reopen the case. And in November 2021, 55 years after the bullets flew, America finally admitted the truth. Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam were exonerated. Their convictions were thrown out. The court admitted that the FBI and the NYPD had withheld crucial evidence during the original trial. They had files, reports, and witness statements that could have cleared these men half a century ago, but they hid them. Why? This brings us to the darkest question of all. FBI surveillance files, now partially declassified, show that J. Edgar Hoover considered Malcolm X a primary target of the COINTELPRO program. They wanted to prevent the rise of a black messiah. On the day of the shooting, usually heavy police presence was mysteriously reduced to almost nothing. The frantic calls for backup went unanswered for too long. The exoneration of 2021 proved one thing. The assassination of Malcolm X was not just a crime committed by 3 men in a ballroom. It was a failure of justice sanctioned by the state. The trigger may have been pulled by enemies from his former faith, but the gun was loaded by a system that wanted him silent. 2 innocent men lost their lives to prison. A family lost a father. And America lost a leader who was just beginning to show us a way out of the darkness. The assassins fired 21 bullets into him, hoping to erase his existence. But they made a fatal miscalculation. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill an idea whose time has come. Malcolm X did not leave behind a vast fortune. He didn't leave behind a political office or a fleet of cars. He left something far more dangerous and far more enduring. He left a legacy of uncompromising dignity. He taught a generation of African Americans that anger in the face of injustice is not a sin. It is a sign of self-respect. He showed us that a man is not defined by his worst mistakes, but by his capacity to change. From the hustler Detroit Red to the visionary El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, his life was proof that redemption is possible for anyone who is brave enough to seek the truth. Today, the Audubon Ballroom is not just a crime scene. It is a memorial. The civil rights movement has evolved, but the questions Malcolm asked remain unanswered. When we see injustice in our streets, when we see power abusing the weak, his voice still echoes. He forces us to look in the mirror and ask, what are you willing to stand for? The tragic assassination and the decades of cover-ups by the FBI and the justice system tried to bury his story in confusion and controversy. But as the Mexican proverb says, they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. Malcolm X was silenced, yes. But in that silence, a million other voices found the courage to speak. Some stories end without closure. But dignity doesn't need applause. It just needs witnesses. And today, by listening to his story, you are that witness. If this story reminded you that the truth is worth fighting for, or if you believe that justice, no matter how late, is always necessary, please honor this history by hitting the like button. It helps us share these forgotten chapters with the world. To anyone who has ever stood alone against the crowd, we see you. What do you think was Malcolm X's greatest contribution? Was it his fire or his evolution? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. We have many more stories of courage and controversy waiting to be told. The world watched him fall. Now, it's up to us to help him rise.